Hi, I'm Dr. Don Boomgarden, President of St. Joseph's College, and I'd like to welcome you to St. Joseph's College, Living Our Mission. Built on tradition and founded by the Sisters of St. Joseph more than 100 years ago, we are a mission-driven institution that provides a strong academic and value-oriented education with growing diverse campuses located in Patchogue and Brooklyn, New York, as well as online. Thank you for joining us. In this program, we will be discussing our experiences of navigating a pandemic while remaining focused and connected. There were so many uncertainties during this past year and a half, and together we all had to learn how to cope and how to preserve our mental health and well-being. To speak more about this is Dr. Thomas Petriano, Professor and Chair of Religious Studies, and Dr. Peter Lin, Professor and Associate Chair of Psychology. Tom, the COVID pandemic forced us to transition from person to remote modalities very abruptly in March of 2020. How was this transition for you, and how was it for your students?
It was very difficult. It was a real challenge. I have such a clear recollection of that afternoon, coming to an afternoon class and finding out that the campus was closed. The security guards were telling us we couldn't enter, we had to go home. Students had the same experience, and I think that is something that stands out in all of our minds that initiated what was a very challenging and difficult time for all of us, and for us as faculty, and I think for students as well. From my perspective as a faculty member, I had to constantly remind myself that this was a really hard time for students, and also to acknowledge my own difficulty in trying to navigate an uncertain future. So I think the first step was really to honestly acknowledge that this was a real time of uncertainty, challenge, anxiety, for me as a professor and for the students, and to recognize that we were all in the same boat together.
It must have been an interesting moment when you had to tell your students that we were going to spend the rest of the semester remote. How did that go for you? How did they respond to that?
Well, I think uncertainty was the word, again, because nobody had ever done this before. I mean, we've had online courses, but we never had virtual courses where we conducted classes through Zoom. And I think it was a time of uncertainty for me, how the class would go, how it would progress, and for students too, like what would be expected of them, what would it be like seeing each other on camera, on the video screen. I think we all were trying to find our way through this new modality of teaching.
Had you taught a course remotely before, a virtual course before?
No, this would have been the first time. Yeah,
because it was, I was teaching as well, and it was the first time for me, and it was a very different experience. On the one hand, there were some positives to it, but on the other hand, it was radically different from any classroom experience that I had had. Peter, how was it for you when the word came down that we were going to have to go remote? How did your students respond to that? How did you communicate with them about it?
Well, I tried to give them the message as calm as possible and try to encourage them that we still can go through this, just like what Tom was saying. We're all in together and we can survive it together. And I never taught on Zoom myself. And especially during a disaster, it is important to have this personal connection. So Zoom, although we cannot see each other in person, Zoom provides us another opportunity to reconnect with our students, which is important to go through a tough disaster or pandemic like this.
And we had the experience at St. Joseph of shifting to remote in the middle of the semester in March. And if you remember back, we were very close to spring break. And I was hoping that at least we would get to spring break to have a chance to have a week to prepare for this, but we didn't even get to spring break. And so we had to shift, basically hundreds of courses into the remote modality right away. And of course, when you planned your course originally, that was not a part of your syllabus. So after you did that semester and you went into the next fall where we continued remote, what did you do to your courses, or how did you change your courses to fit that new modality?
For me, the new modality required a different kind of teaching, because you had some students at least the way I was teaching it, in the fall, I was teaching hybrid courses. So I had a small number of students in the classroom, and then the other half of the class was at home. And the challenge was really addressing two different groups of students, the students that were in person in the classroom and then the students that were home. So that required a whole different way of teaching. And I relied a lot on using PowerPoints so that the students, because I couldn't use the board as much as I do when I'm teaching in a classroom, because the students at home were not able to see the whiteboard with their cameras. So it really necessitated a different style of teaching.
And Peter, what about you? How did you change your approach?
I think I try to adapt my person-to-person skill into the virtual world, because I think teaching, one of the most important things about teaching is building relationship. I think when you have relationship with your students, things can get easier. So even when I'm doing Zoom in a hybrid course, I try to make sure everyone is as involved as possible. So I don't let people just turn off their camera and just relax. I always try to engage in a real conversation with them. So on my Zoom or in the real world, I try to keep it as similar as possible.
I think that was exactly the challenge, to engage the students at home while you're trying to engage the students that are with you in the classroom. That was definitely.
Yeah, I think sometimes, we use that word class participation, and it should really be class engagement, right? They should be, how are they engaged? They might not be talking, but at least they're engaged. And one of the disadvantages to the remote approach was that, my students sometimes would turn off their camera, so I would just see a name, and I'm hoping that they're there. And frequently they were. But it was always a very strange experience to be talking to that screen. And I think that, today we're talking about what did we do to help our students navigate through this difficult time, but it was difficult to navigate as a faculty member.
Right.
Absolutely difficult.
Because you lose that contact with the student. And I remember very clearly when we ended the semester, typically when you have your last class, the students will come up to you and they'll say, hopefully, they'll say, well, Dr. Boomgarden, that was a really great class. Thank you so much. And I learned a lot. And you have that kind of warm and fuzzy moment at the end of the semester. And last year when I ended the class, I said, students, you were great. Thank you so much for being with me. They all just turned off their video cameras and I was sitting alone in the office. I don't know. So you probably had the same experience.
Absolutely.
Right? Well, Peter, the pandemic brought with it a lot of uncertainty. I know you're an expert in mindfulness, you're an expert in mental health. What did you do to help the students to preserve their mental health through this crisis?
So I think before the pandemic, I'm actually pretty involved in disaster mental health. So I have some training in that area. And I think one of the and pandemic is a disaster, which is different than other disaster, where usually a disaster would just end, but this pandemic just keep going. And as a disaster mental health professional would do is, one of the most important things, provide correct information to start with, because safety is very important, which also includes safe information, correct information. So one thing I actually help my student to do is to provide as much useful mental health information to them as possible. In fact, we both actually ran some webinar on campus to provide some useful tips for our college community. So I think was something that we can do as faculty, to provide the correct information.
Were there some, when you did the webinar and when you were talking to your students about this, were there some common themes or common issues that they were having?
So I think the common challenge people have is really to deal with this agitation, this nervousness, this anxiety, and this feeling that things not going to get better. So although it's a webinar about information, but I think what webinar does is also connections. I'm going to go back to the theme I'm talking about. When people are in a tough time, relationship can really bring people together. So even though I'm providing information, but what we are really doing is to provide some empathic understanding. So when people feel understood, they could really have the ability to move on.
I found, especially in the spring when we first started, that students, all of us were really under a kind of lockdown. We're not interacting too much socially as we ordinarily would. And the connections that they would have through our Zoom classes were helpful to them because it gave them a sense of connection that was missing in the rest of their lives because we couldn't do much. But from their homes, they could.
And I guess one of the positives about the experience for me was I started to use techniques and technology I'd never seen before. For example, discussion boards, things which engaged the students and allowed them to respond to one another outside of the Zoom period of time that we had. And those kind of conversations back and forth between them were really critical. Did you have that experience as well?
Yeah, I think that ability through the exchange on discussion boards to find out that we're all going through this difficult time together was something that was a bit reassuring for them, and for us to model that too. I think during that time I thought a lot about vulnerability, and I became aware of my own vulnerability, my own anxiety, my own fear for myself, my family, my mom, and to let students know that it's okay, to experience this vulnerability, but we're all in this together and we could find strength and support from each other.
Well, I know both of you did a fantastic job with your students, and so we're going to continue this discussion. We have to take a quick break, but still to come, more about navigating through the COVID-19 pandemic.
Are you ready?
To work together and stand out.
Ready?
To find solutions that push us forward.
Ready?
To take on today's challenges and take charge of our future. With a world-class education at St. Joseph's College in Patchogue, you will be ready. Attend an upcoming event to find out how. For scheduling information, visit sjcny.edu/LI events.
Are you ready?
St. Joseph's College.
Ready, set,
Joe's.
Are you ready?
To work together and stand out.
ready?
To find solutions that push us forward.
Ready.
To take on today's challenges and take charge of our future. With a world-class education at St. Joseph's College in Brooklyn, you will be ready. Attend an upcoming event to find out how. For scheduling information, visit sjcny.edu/BK events.
Are you ready?
St. Joseph's College.
Ready.
Set.
Joe's.
Welcome back to St. Joseph's College, Living Our Mission. We were discussing how to cope and stay focused during trying times. And I'm speaking today with Tom Petriano and Peter Lin, two of the wonderful professors that we have at St. Joseph's College, who worked so diligently and with such courage through the last 2 years with us. Tom, as chair of the Religious Studies Department, how important is religion in coping and dealing with this kind of crisis?
I think it turned out to be extremely important. Certainly religion in the broadest sense of the term. Students really were looking for something. Students were looking for something to hold on to, some kind of assurance, some kind of security, and religious traditions offer that. And I think it was a time that forced all of us to look inwardly, and it was a time of introspection. And it gave me the opportunity in the courses I was teaching to talk about how sort of the religious traditions can help us navigate difficult times. That's something Peter and I did together in the webinar, whether it be cultivating calm or stillness or meditation or prayer, that there are resources that religious traditions offer us for coping with these difficult times.
When you are teaching a subject like religious studies, and you're clearly discussing religion with the students on a regular basis, how did they describe or present their journey through the pandemic and their relationship to whatever faith practice that they're familiar with?
Yeah. It was interesting how the courses that I was teaching, especially that spring semester, sort of lent themselves to helping the students find their way through this time with a little bit of adapting on my part. Like one of the courses I was teaching was the Bible as literature, and once we switched to virtual Zoom classes, I had to totally reconfigure the course. But for example, we were talking about the Psalms, because we're looking at the Bible as literature, and the Psalms, many of the Psalms are Psalms of lamentation, Psalms of frustration and anxiety with conditions that the Jewish people were experiencing. And the assignment that I gave them, which was different than I had anticipated when I first planned the course, was to write their own psalm. And that turned out to be a really interesting, valuable experience for them to kind of take something like the 23rd Psalm or one of the other Psalms of Lamentation, and then on the basis of their experience in the pandemic at that moment to create their own psalm. I think it helped them.
Yes, it's astonishing when you look at the Bible, for example, and you look at the Psalms. If you are not going through a time of trial and tribulation, you might not notice that so many of the Psalms are all about
Exactly.
that. And so it's an incredible consolation, isn't it, to realize that for centuries, these feelings have been a part of our experience. And so the Psalms are so rich with those
They
types
took
of
on a
lamentations.
totally new meaning, I think.
Exactly. And I think that that depth is a part of, when we talk about St. Joseph's College, a lot of people think of us as a Catholic college, which we are in our tradition. But the reality is we have students from all faith traditions. And our emphasis, our core value is spiritual depth, spiritual knowledge. So whatever faith that you're coming from, at St. Joseph's College, we're going to work with you on that, because all of those things have commonalities.
Yes.
And that commonality of spirituality. Peter, did you have that same experience with your students?
Yeah, I think, well, we both run this minor, mindfulness and contemplative living minors. So part of the goal of this minor is to help one to be more spiritual. I think it doesn't matter which tradition you're from. All spirituality practice have a same kind of goal, which is to really make ourselves smaller and connect with others. So during the pandemic, you teach the course on Bible, I teach a course on mindfulness, meditation, so I teach students how to relax and calm their mind, yet at the same time, the purpose of calming yourself is to really to cultivate the virtue, to serve others. So one thing I always encourage our students is to keep a relaxed mind, but then also practice citizenship. At this tough time, we calm ourselves, we help others to also deal with this tough time.
And the tough time, even though we don't want to relive it, is where we learn. Where we learn about ourselves, we learn about the world around us. And these young people, in many cases, frankly, a lot of people would be surprised at how sophisticated young people are today. But many of them have not had as many life experiences as the three of us. And so when they go through something like that, this is all new to them. It's all very dramatic and traumatic. But at the same time, as a teacher, it's also a great teachable moment, because they're riveted by, let's say, the Psalms of Lamentation. In my class, for example, in North American folk music, we do a number of gospel pieces and spiritual pieces. And many of the musical works of North American roots music are about struggle and about failure and about all kinds of difficulties. And they took on new meaning to the students, new depth to the students through the pandemic. So I don't want to relive it, and I'm sure you don't, but in a way, it was a moment for the students to really become deeper as people. And I think, Peter, that's what you mean when you talk about the different traditions. They're all trying to help us to become smaller. We should grow less. Spirituality should grow more.
Yeah, I think the concept is that we can both be victim in this pandemic or survivor. And we can all learn some existential lesson, right? The lesson of death and dying, the lesson of purpose and meaning. So this is a great opportunity to explore what is the purpose of life, what is the purpose of death and dying.
Yes.
And I think all spiritual tradition invite us to explore that question.
Yeah. And you touch on a really important point in terms of death was very real.
Oh yeah.
Many of these families, many of these students experienced death. We all did, and seeing it in people that we were connected to. I mean, there was a point, I wrote many condolence notes during the pandemic to families, staffers, faculty members, even students who had lost loved ones. I remember one week I wrote 8 in 1 week.
Yeah.
And as I was writing these things, I was just thinking, this is so strange that as president, I'm writing this many condolence letters. And I could see in the faces of the students in their family environments that there were certain families that were really struggling with the virus at that time. And so that lent a seriousness to everything that we were doing. And I think that it also lent meaning to what the three of us are doing in terms of teaching, because it was that joy of learning in many cases that was the bright part of their day. Right?
Yes.
Right.
I think very much so.
Right.
And I think it's interesting we're having this conversation now because Peter and I, before we began the mindfulness minor, would have these very same conversations among ourselves about our different religious traditions and sort of the common elements underlying those different religious traditions. And that led us to the mindfulness minor that students, especially the psychology students, right, Peter, are really enjoying taking, and involves taking some religious studies courses as well. And I think having set up that minor and developed mindfulness courses was helpful to both of us and in the pandemic.
Yeah. It's a learning experience for both of us.
Yes,
too.
yes.
Yeah.
Now, Peter and Tom, what advice would you give to people who now we're coming out of the pandemic and we're starting to move away from it, but we're still traumatized by it? So what advice would you give to people who are at this point trying to move forward?
I think one of the things that was important during the pandemic and not to be lost sight of as we're navigating hopefully toward a conclusion of some kind, whenever that may be, cultivating calm and stillness, I think, is important, and replacing uncertainty with trust. You know, those all the spiritual traditions kind of encourage us toward trust in times of uncertainty, and cultivating stillness and calm. I think those are important tools. That's what helped me for sure, and that's what I tried to model for students as well.
Yeah, I agree. Calm and stillness is a sort of a foundation, and let this calm and stillness generate sort of insight or a new way of looking at this disaster or this pandemic. And then this insight will help us to generate compassion and empathy for others. So this is something, I think there's a whole package. Let this pandemic be a sort of a good lesson for all of us. Even right now, we're talking about it. We're really showing how we witness this difficult situation. And people feel, when people feel witnessed and understood by others, it kind of helps all of us connect.
And you mentioned, too, the idea of modeling and of many times as teachers, we don't think of ourselves as role models. We don't really even want to be role models in many cases, but we are to them. And so the work that both you, Tom, and Peter, the work that you have done modeling those approaches, how to deal with the crisis, how to deal with this kind of trauma in life, is so important and so valuable. And I want to just thank you publicly for the incredible job that you did, and frankly, an astonishing work that you've done on the mindfulness minor and the collaboration between psychology and religious studies. I think it's really a pretty creative and unusual aspect of St. Joseph's College. It's part of, you know, it's one of the reasons we're such a great school, is that we have that kind of creativity in the way we approach things. So thank both of you so much for that.
Sure. And thank you for leading the college through this difficult time as well, Don.
Well,
yeah, you really set the tone, I think.
I tried, but I hope I don't have to do it again. Right. Well, thank you for joining us today, and thank you all for watching St. Joseph's Living Our Mission. I hope this information has been useful to anyone who is struggling to remain connected and focused. Be sure to take care of yourselves. We hope to see you again soon. Thanks for watching.